very good, just-in-time fireside chat. Great to have you here.
Likewise, it's great to be here.
Welcome to Riga. I think it's your first time, right?
It is. It's my first time in Riga. I mean, I'm really excited. I've been to Tallinn, to Estonia, but yeah, Latvia never. So this is my first time. So far, so great.
Fantastic. So we found some sunshine for you, a little bit. It's not that common here.
Yeah.
So maybe just to set the stage, if you can do a quick background, sort of how you got here, what's the current company you're working on, so everyone kind of has the context.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm South Korean. I was raised in Los Angeles. My university, I have a background in computational linguistics, so a technical background. So I did part of my studies in the States, and then I did the latter part of my studies over in the UK. So over in the States in Chicago, and then in the UK for my master's at Oxford. For me, I knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur through and through. And so pretty much immediately, I went into starting companies. Exactly. Most notably, there were the two YC-backed companies. The first was a company called Ncord, and it's a software company that at first really focused on data annotation for AI use cases. We had different sector focuses in the beginning, and then now it's expanded beyond that. And the second company was a company called Parlan. So throughout those journeys, throughout the journey of those two companies, and I would say, in and out of that, I did quite a lot of angel investing in different founders. One thing that stood out as a commonality was just that, it was just really difficult to operate in different international contexts. On one end, when you're very, very early days, you can get around maybe having, part of your team in San Francisco, part of your team, let's say in London, or let's say in Berlin, or even here in Riga. But at a certain point, that really quickly catches up. And it was always just sort of a pain with whether it was myself or whether it was sort of with portfolio companies of mine, just getting them in touch with the right people, and usually attorneys. That was always just such a pain in the butt. I guess I can't swear here on stage, but it was that much of a pain point. You always found that the attorneys would just run you a large bill. They would sometimes they'd make a lot of mistakes, and you would be at any given point in time talking to 5 different attorneys for 5 different things, everything from immigration to corporate structuring to employment to what have you. And so, that's really motivated the new product that we're working on. I would actually say more of a service, but we're operating a tech-enabled and AI-native law firm today. It's called Expedite.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And then, so if we go back a little bit to talk about sort of founders and moving in different geographies, when you first went to YC, you moved from Oxford to the US, right? Yeah. And so, why? And was that capital? Was that cultural? What were you looking for in terms of that move?
Yeah, I would say it was actually a bit of both and everything, right? So I think definitely the biggest pool of a capital source is out in Silicon Valley, and you can really feel that raising it's a much smoother process when you go out to San Francisco. Even just spending a few weeks out in San Francisco, you'll really sort of feel that difference. And then definitely there's a cultural point as well. I think what's pretty unique about San Francisco is, at least even in the minds of, I would say, a lot of different Europeans, in the minds of Americans, when you say San Francisco, you immediately associate that with tech, right? If I were to tell you a city like London, tech wouldn't be like one of the first sort of things that you would think about, right? Sure. But I think because you have that very unique dimension to San Francisco, you also have the cultural sort of congregation of very like-minded individuals of different technologists that, you can walk into any sort of cafe and you'll find just pure serendipity of different technologists that are building something, operators, founders, venture capitalists, et cetera. And so I find that there was a cultural point of that as well that really sort of motivated a lot of the move anytime I've, decided to operate any company, really.
Okay. And when you're back in London now,
yeah.
right? So what changed?
Exactly. So I think right now, I still want to emphasize that we do have a large U.S. presence, but I think one of the sort of unique things that I would say is you really want to follow where your clients, your users, et cetera, are, in addition to a capital source. And so for us, as we are operating this, an international law firm for global founders, London just seemed like a really good sort of center point to kind of interact with a lot of our clients, to help the folks in the US, but also to kind of help a lot of European founders as well.
Is that because Europe is just legally complex, and so there's like much more opportunity to fix stuff?
It's exactly that, right? Just because there's so much more fragmentation over here, that like you said, you have a lot of structuring complexity. You might have a lot of immigration complexity as well. So it's exactly that we find that London is really a good sort of halfway point between the U.S. and sort of broader Europe.
And I guess a follow-on to that is sort of, can you comment on the difference in terms of London and Europe more broadly, from when you left to go to the Valley to now you've come back? What's changed?
Definitely. I mean, I would actually say that the ecosystem in multiple different cities over here has just really evolved, right? I think you can see a lot of this startup ethos starting to develop in whether it is London, whether it is here in Riga, whether it's, let's say, I bring up Berlin. I was in Stockholm and in Copenhagen even a few weeks ago, right? And I would say the electricity of founders, especially really starting from like younger ages, I think you start to see that more and more. Whereas I would say even 5 or 10 years back, that sort of an ecosystem didn't really exist. And so I think that there's a lot more of a leaning into the startup ecosystem here that I see in Europe. Just viscerally, you feel it.
So then back to YC. So what impact do you think that has on an investor like YC, the YC effect?
Yeah.
How much of that is like it's because we have to be in the Valley and that's where things happen, which may not be as true anymore, or is it really a brand, sort of mark of credibility?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I think nowadays you start to see, you have a lot of the US incubators. Of course, you also see, I think there was a talk right before this about, your Project Europes of the world that are also equally viable incubator options, accelerator options over here in Europe. I would still say that there is, there's always a benefit to having this sort of presence, because of, and maybe experiencing it for let's say a few weeks. Just kind of going over, see what's happening in San Francisco and sort of creating that comparative for yourself. But I would say for YC specifically, there's definitely always that global recognition of a stamp on your, on sort of like your credibility as a founder when people see Y Combinator. So whether that is, operating in SF, whether that is operating over here in Europe, I think that there is really good credibility and validity to applying. And you've actually seen it, right? I think one note on YC is that they've started to, even statistically, you just see that they've accepted a lot more European founders because I think that they recognize the talent density that they're missing out on over here in Europe.
Yeah, we know it. We're investors into YC startups, so we've seen what it means. So the description of the session that we're running now had, mentioned the pain of relocation. So sort of what was your nightmare moment? What was the pain that you could recount as a story that sort of highlights this?
I mean, definitely on a few occasions, right? I mean, the most salient, obvious one is even for our own startup right now, right? We're operating in London. We are, a U.S. corporation. We also have a U.S. law firm. We're also, getting legally qualified over here in the U.K. We have, clients in all jurisdictions, and structuring is such a nightmare. And then also in terms of employment as well, as we have a few different teammates in the U.S. that we're trying to migrate over into the U.K. Of course, that is. That's a nightmare as well on the immigration side. So there's struggles on both of those regards. And then another sort of salient pain point is with one of my portfolio companies. I remember we were just we were just going for coffee in London, right? And he was, you know, sort of the reverse migration, right? He was looking into to setting up shop in San Francisco. And we're just getting, you know, casual hangout, meetup, and we're talking about how his company is going and how he's thinking about his relocation. You know, I'm not the richest person in the world, and as an angel investor in his company, I almost had a heart attack hearing what the legal bill was just to have him immigrate and all the sort of structuring work that he had to do in order to go over to the US. So, you know, those are sort of like two of the most recent memories that I have of like, oh man, you know, in between just doing a very, very hacky solution and then going to a law firm like a global law firm like a Latham Watkins or a Cooley, there's really nothing in the middle. And so those are, I think, two memorable moments for me where it was like,
but it seems that you also believe, you know, since you're running this company that has that as a thesis, you believe that the complexity will, the need to move back and forth and move employees back and forth will continue.
Yeah.
And that, you know, the legal complexity will be a problem to manage.
Exactly. It's exactly that. I mean, you know, I think it's becoming more and more common nowadays for sort of this mobility happening both ways, right? Even if you're two people out of a garage, let's say like, you know, you start a company in Riga, and let's say you hire a few employees and you look to go out to fundraise and you understand that maybe a capital source is in San Francisco, maybe you want to sell to Americans. And so, you know, you incorporate a Delaware C corporation. But, you know, for the first 6 to 12 months, you're operating over here in Riga. And then, you know, you're still kind of going back and forth to the States. Let's say you recognize that there's a really good talent density over here in Riga. And so, you know, you as founders move over to San Francisco, but you continue to hire in Riga, right? You need to start to give them, maybe you have equity incentives that you want to give them. Maybe now you've raised money from this Delaware C Corp and you need to send funds, right? Mm-hmm. All of these sorts of things, I think, are just happening at a more frequent pace than we think, and it's happening just from day one. Whereas before, it may have happened when you were already a company of 30 to 40 people. I think that people are really catching on to where the advantages play to having, let's say, like operations in Europe, and where it, you know, makes sense to have operations and sales and et cetera in the US or the UK. And so, yeah, you just see that so frequently nowadays.
So you would come across transfer pricing problems
exactly, right off the bat,
and,
like you said.
And so maybe for those who haven't dealt with transfer pricing, and I hope most of you don't have to deal with the details, maybe you want to give a quick update on that.
Exactly. I mean, on a high level, right, if you have an entity over here in Latvia and you have an entity in the US and you just have your capital source, all the money was in US dollars, you kind of need a way to move it over into your Latvian entity, maybe to pay salaries, other operations. And so, in essence, that's what we would call transfer pricing, and that's a big problem.
Yeah, and you can do serious mess ups in taxes.
Yes.
If you don't do it right.
Exactly.
And so yeah, getting that right is important. So let's bring in the AI buzzword.
Yeah.
How are you using AI now, and how do you see in general AI having an impact on solving these problems at scale?
Yeah, it's exactly that. You know, we would never fully delegate all of this work to AI, right? That's a really daunting thing, and of course, you know, there's a lot on the line, especially when it comes to legal services. But to the extent that AI can really sort of expedite a lot of no pun intended, actually. But to the extent that AI can really help, you know, expedite the workflows of attorneys, you know, that's what we're really going for, right? If you can get sort of that 10, 20x efficiency, everything from the drafting process of different documents to, let's even say, helping out with legal review, right? That an attorney would do to scan additional documents, but you could have AI do an additional pass. To even doing any kind of legal research, right? These are three main buckets that we ourselves might use AI in. At the end of the day, of course, though, like everything is sort of stamped off, and you know, the sort of input and the creativity is thrown in by an attorney. But that's sort of, you know, it's almost kind of giving AI a very specific directive in very specific areas, and then having it run with it.
Yeah, interesting. And so if you fast forward to this being, you know, your company being successful and the AI revolution moving forward, so would kind of the goal be to make a founder's physical location irrelevant?
It's exactly that, right? I mean, founders, you guys are so busy building. I mean, we even see with the founders that are our clients right now, you don't. At the end of the day, the founder shouldn't be the one that has to care about, a lot of taxation concerns or a lot of these mobility concerns. And so we want it so relevant for them that they can just continue to work on their businesses and not have a heart attack with the legal bill as well, right? So it's sort of and just have this assurance that they can be sorted. They don't have to speak to 10 lawyers. They don't have to, even seek out from their network who they should go to, right? It's just, that they can just trust one person, effectively almost like a general counsel from early on. They could say, hey, what's happening with this? Oh, it's sorted, right? And that's sort of the idea.
Okay, on a global basis.
On a global basis, it's exactly that. And I think AI is really enabling that, right? If you buy into the thesis that AI, information seeking can happen at the snap of a finger, if you believe that, you have these efficiency gains even with drafting documents, et cetera, at the snap of a finger, well, then you can believe that, the sort of traditional legal system of really just being able to specialize in one practice area, well, you can cover that for so many different domains as well.
Okay, interesting. And then what does that mean for sort of physical location being irrelevant, but there's time zones, so you won't be able to change time.
Exactly.
Not yet. So how do you think about that? Teams being together, being in the same time zone is, so from here to Silicon Valley, it's a 9-hour time difference. So,
yeah.
We hear, founders having the question of if they go to the US, should it be New York or San Francisco? Because New York's, 3 hours closer.
Yeah.
How do you think about this problem?
It's a good question. I mean, the way that I think about this is that, even we ourselves just really, really value the sort of, maybe there are a lot of tangible but also intangible factors of just being physically co-located, right? And so what we've found that helps, and even sort of at scale, is really just having this in clusters. And so, if you had, for example, your engineering function, maybe it would be worth it to have all of them in one particular location, right? If you have an operational cluster, to the extent that it doesn't require you to have multiple presences of operation, to also have that in clusters, right? And really just have sort of key senior leadership in different sort of points of different geographies.
The leadership team that's hopping on planes all the time between the clusters?
It's exactly that. It's the leadership team that's really maintaining the sort of the communication between the clusters, but the clusters themselves really just being located in physical sort of places. Yeah.
So you're not promising founders won't have to get on planes all the time to go back and forth across the Atlantic?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's if you're a founder, you're signing up for that, going back and forth. So you better love flying.
Yeah, exactly. And then going to your investor role. Right. So, so you've been an angel investor. You've also been involved in a fund.
Right.
Maybe tell a little bit more about what kind of investing you've done for context.
Yeah, definitely. For me, it's actually everything from like the earliest stages to even very late stages, with even sort of running SPVs. For later stage companies. So some of the more notable investments would be, there's a company called Cohere. They're a foundational lab that has a global presence, but mainly is based in Canada. Perplexity as well, which is another sort of foundational AI company. I would say those are sort of the more notable ones, but it sort of spans, I would say, across the board with different domains, different sort of technologies and different functions.
And for those companies, then what's the conversation you've had with those founders about moving to the US, not moving to the US? How do you advise them on thinking about that?
It's a good question. So usually for me, the sort of the argument for not moving over to the US is really, if you have any kind of if you operate within let's say regulated spaces, and the regulations would require you to, you're building for a particular geography. Let's say maybe within defense tech, right, where there's sort of a question of sovereignty. That's another sort of consideration there as well. Exactly, biomedical sciences, et cetera. I would also say for a lot of even like banking infrastructure, a lot of infrastructure that might be very regional. Let's say a Monzo, for example, right? I might not necessarily urge a Monzo to go over and penetrate into the US market, especially when you already have so many US-based challenger banks around, right? And so these are maybe some of the considerations. But at the very least, I always just urge founders to spend a couple of weeks in the States, and I think, almost make that judgment call for themselves. You never want to be the one to say you should or should not prescriptively do this. But I think, to the extent that at least for a lot of my portfolio companies, I tell them, just spend some time in San Francisco. I'll try to leverage as many connections as I can for you to just get a feel of the ecosystem, and you yourself can realize whether or not you can get some tangible benefit from being in San Francisco.
Yeah, and is it the case that, the sort of public perception of Silicon Valley is all shiny, but when you get there, you're just like a tiny little founder, and it's actually much harder to make use of that network because everyone has their own friends there, and it's tough to integrate.
It's sometimes and sometimes that certainly is the case. I've found as well. If for example you have a ton of Americans that have grown up in San Francisco, that went to university, say in the San Francisco and San Francisco adjacent areas. Then they probably already have their networks, and it's very, very difficult to penetrate into those networks. So you're right. That could become very, very difficult in context, for example, like hiring. For sales, maybe getting in the right room. I think sometimes, but not really so much. But I think when it comes to attracting talent density, I've seen that is the case. And so I actually have seen a lot of moves where people might go to San Francisco. They also try to move their engineering team to San Francisco, but then eventually end up ditching that idea because they find that, let's say, their technical team, they have a much easier time attracting talent over here in Europe. And so then they have this split. Once again, from day one, where they're managing, let's say, some part of their team from a European country, and then they have their sales function, or let's say the founders are spending a significant amount of time in San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever seen a company move their engineering function to San Francisco? Because I would kind of see that as like a dumb decision. They're going to get poached very fast.
Exactly. I've seen people try and then immediately realize, oh, that's not a good idea.
Yeah. Because founders are much harder to poach, right? You have serious equity in the business, like you're running the business.
Exactly.
But like your team, along comes Meta with a big fat check. Right?
It's exactly that. So, we've seen maybe they think that, hey, they do want to move their entire team, and that's why we go back to this idea of operating clusters. But sometimes people just want, instead of having multiple clusters, just a single cluster in one place. And that's where the sort of idea of let's try to do San Francisco for everybody plays in. And it becomes very difficult to then manage some of the factors that you mentioned.
Yeah. So a couple of other questions. We're going off script now, so these are all surprises. So one is, how closely have you been following the EU Inc., the proposals in Europe to come up with another 28th regime? Sort of what do you think might be the impact of that on the ability of startups in Europe to be based here, stay here, registered here, and compete?
Definitely. I think that's something that we've been, of course, following closely because it'd make our lives a lot easier.
I would think so.
Exactly. And so, I think it's one of these things where not to really put Delaware C corps and Delaware corporations on a pedestal, but I think one of the reasons why a lot of American investors are just very, very comfortable investing in let's say a Delaware C corp is the fact that you can believe that it's a proven business jurisdiction, that it's tried and tested, that there are millions of companies that have just incorporated in Delaware. And so if there are any kind of disputes, any kind of arbitration that has to happen, you can just be sure that, that Delaware, as sort of a legal jurisdiction, will have you covered for any sort of business.
There's a ton of case law. Every single possible scenario has already been tried and tested, right?
I mean, even so much so that a lot of European investors would even urge companies to just set up a Delaware C Corp from day one, right? Because they know, hey, this is a tried and tested jurisdiction. And so I think, of course, the EU needs something like this, right? You can't just have, let's say you're a Latvian founder, but maybe you're also hiring, let's say, different Lithuanian engineers or in different jurisdictions. Let's say you, but actually it turns out the founders themselves are, from Estonia, right? Like there's so much complexity. It would just be so much easier if you had a tried and tested, something similar to the Delaware C Corp in Europe. And I think, that's where we're all hoping for an EU Inc. It would just, like I said, make our lives so much easier, and I guess, hopefully we can all agree upon that.
But I don't know how closely you've read the proposals. We had the commissioner here this morning, and we're challenging her a bit that the proposals don't include a single legal regime. It's going to be, you'll have a single point of registration and so forth, but you'll still be regulated under one of the 27 national legislations.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's exactly that, right? That for me would be a massive flaw, because it would almost sort of defeat the purpose of having, let's say, an EU Inc., right? But then different regulatory bodies. I think the goal, at least in my opinion, is to have, the outcome, if we go with sort of like an outcome-focused approach, is to just have an entity where it would make it so much easier to operate for everybody. Right, and so if you think about the failures of that proposal, like you mentioned, it's exactly that, right? If you have multiple different regulatory bodies, well, then what is the purpose?
That will be tough. Yeah. So another offbeat question is sort of diving a little bit into the political area. So how do you see the change in the U.S. administration affecting potentially talent, maybe even starting to migrate to Europe? I've seen some numbers that actually, the migration, the brain drain might be coming the other direction. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I see it both ways. I still see that there is, that at the end of the day, Silicon Valley still sort of retains its ethos of innovation, and so there is a lot of capital there. So I see, of course, quite a lot of Europeans wanting to move over to the States. But you're right, a lot of them do face a lot of friction. Just to kind of paint some color, right? Within even U.S. immigration processes, it's sort of a two-step process where you get the stamp of approval from your U.S. visa. And then after that, you have your sort of consular interview. And that consular interview, you can really run into some sticky problems that would then, maybe delay your process of moving to the U.S. for another 6 months, because the U.S. is doing this, a comprehensive background check on you. And we've seen the number of, let's say, like these administrative processing procedures happening, even after, let's say, you've gotten your stamp of approval of let's say, like a U.S. talent visa, right? And so we've seen that really hold people back, and it's exactly that, right? Like that sort of, if the administrative friction of moving over to the States continues, I think it's exactly that. We'll see a lot less migration. Whereas, in the case of, let's say, the UK, we've seen quite a lot of migration over to the UK because it's fairly easy. Well, not anymore with Brexit, but let's say if we assume that now Brexit
that changed too.
Well, that's changed quite a bit. But let's say, for example, for Americans moving over to the UK, because that hasn't necessarily been affected, what we've seen is that the sort of visa schemes that the UK has, and sort of the processes to apply for these visas has just become increasingly easier for actually just any third country national. And so you see quite a lot of mobility there as well, but also into the EU more broadly.
Okay, and so last question is sort of, you're sitting in Europe now, so sort of what's your expectation, vision, ideas for how Europe could be as a home for startups in the future? What do you see in the next 10, 20 years ahead? I
mean, for me, the next 10, 20 years ahead, I think we see this tailwind of the ecosystem growing more and more, right? I mean, whether it's this event that's a testament, TechChill, that's a testament to the strength of European founders, or I think whether it is sort of other ecosystems, and you can even see a lot of these like quote unquote a lot of the sort of tier 1 U.S. funds, whether it is like your Sequoia Capitals or your Index and Excel Venture, sort of a lot of them having strong presences in the U.S., but then also sort of scaling their presences in Europe. I think we're starting to see a lot of capital also pour into Europe, and I think with that capital, you'll start to just see a lot more founders that are just popping up in the ecosystem.
Super.
So for me, I think that the next 10 to 20 years, I definitely see, let's say, like a lot of concentration of startups and maybe different hubs that will start to pop up left and right over here.
Fantastic. Well, we agree with you, and we're very grateful you came here to tell this story. So
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Give it up for Leeho.
Yep. Thank you, Andris.
Thank you.
Yep.